Good afternoon. On behalf of NISAC President Marty Sauerbry and our Executive Director Stephen Aquario, I want to thank you for joining us for a webinar this afternoon on Backup to Recovery, a critical cybersecurity tool when ransomware impacts your county. Ransomware ranks among the fastest growing cybersecurity threats facing today's governments. Ransomware is often designed to spread across a network and can quickly paralyze an entire organization. It is a growing threat, generating billions of dollars in payments to cybercriminals and inflicting significant damage and expenses for businesses and governmental organizations. State and local agencies are particularly vulnerable to ransomware because having smaller budgets and workforces than their federal peers, they are perceived as soft targets. Today's webinar is designed to examine one aspect of ransomware preparedness. Constant vigilance helps foil possible attacks, it's true, but counties also need the right tools to shield their data in the event of a breach. Proper and timely backups can recover quickly and reliably with as little data loss and financial impact as possible. Developing and testing a strong remediation plan prior to an attack should be a top priority for counties and government agency IT organizations across the state and nation. This webinar will cover a key part of that remediation plan. And again, thank you for joining us. I would like to turn it over to the NISAC Director of Education and Training, Jeanette Stanziano, who is coordinating today's webinar. Jeanette.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just a couple of housekeeping points. We will be recording this program and posting it with a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation on the NISAC website under the Education and Webinars tab. So you can find that first thing tomorrow morning on NISAC's website. We encourage you to submit questions during this webinar. The way to do that is to go to your dashboard and click on the Questions tab, type in your question and submit it at any point during the presentation. And we will address all questions that we have time to get to in the last 15 minutes of this program when we do a moderated Q&A portion. We'd also like to thank our sponsor for this program today. Our sponsor is NIMWR, the New York Municipal Insurance Reciprocal, which provides property, casualty, and cybersecurity insurance for 33 counties and over 900 cities, towns, and villages across New York State. Its mission for almost 28 years has been to provide the most comprehensive insurance and risk management programs for the local governments of New York State. Please contact Kevin Crawford, Executive Director, if you would like further information. Again, the slide deck will be on our website. You can locate Kevin's information on those slides. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Jeanette. I happened to be with NIMWR this morning, and we were talking about cybersecurity and cybersecurity insurance. So this is a timely webinar. As attendees to this webinar understand or will understand, cybersecurity insurance coverage often requires a local government or an organization to meet certain criteria, such as multi-factor authentication and a solid plan for backup and recovery of your data. Today's webinar fits into this overall plan, and we thank NIMWR again for continuously responding to the needs of localities in New York State. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, who comes from Rubrik, which is an industry-leading company that helps organizations achieve data backup to drive business resiliency, cloud mobility, and regulatory compliance. Jeffrey Phelan is the public sector CTO for Rubrik, where his main responsibilities are assisting organizations across the DoD, Intel community, federal, civilian, and state and local governments with their digital transformation efforts, cloud migration, data management, and infrastructure automation requirements. He joined Rubrik from GDIT, where he was the portfolio lead on DISA's MilCloud 2.0 program, where he was responsible for developing the cloud service catalog, technology roadmap, and professional services delivery for all agencies and mission partners moving to the DoD Impact Level 5 fit for purpose cloud computing environment. That's a lot there, and we are lucky to have Jeff with us today. Prior to joining GDIT, Jeff was Chief Product Evangelist and Director of Strategic Growth for Northrop Grumman Information Systems, where he focused on artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques for network defense and cybersecurity, cloud applications, and IT automation. Jeff, without further ado, thank you for joining us and lending your time and expertise with our members this afternoon.
Thanks, Mark. Can you guys hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a bit of a mouthful. I have to tell those guys to shorten that up quite a bit. So I appreciate you working through that. So welcome, everybody. We're going to dive right in, and we're going to talk about backup recovery and overall enterprise resilience, which I think is going to be very, very helpful, and we'll hopefully walk everybody through some good details here. So a real quick intro just in terms of Rubrik. As Mark mentioned, we're a relatively new company. We're about 7 years old, but we're the fastest growing software company in the history of Silicon Valley. A lot of that has to do with what's going on in the cybersecurity space and what's happening with malware. Rubrik is the de facto data protection platform for the intelligence community. We're deployed across all 6 headquarter locations for the U.S. government. We're also operating at what's referred to as at FedRAMP High, Impact Level 5, which is sensitive but unclassified, Impact Level 6, or SIPRNet, which is secret, as well as JWICS, which is top secret. We're typically deployed in dark sites as well as in large data center environments. We're working with all the major cloud vendors, and we're used to dealing with nation states and very, very aggressive adversaries. And the important part here is that all of the technology that we've developed for the intelligence community and for the Department of Defense is available to New York State. There's no additional licensing fees or costs or other things. So we're going to walk you through a little bit of that here today. What I wanted to do initially was level set. So we've got close to 4,000 customers, and as we go in and talk to agencies at the state and local level, as well as across the federal government and public sector, every organization has some modernization strategy that they've documented and put in place. And we normally come in, depending on what the priorities of the organization are, around one of these 4 areas you see here on the right side. They're trying to modernize the infrastructure, reduce complexity, avoid costs, begin to take advantage of automation, both in the infrastructure and with cloud. Security, which is our bread and butter, they need to make sure that as they're modernizing their operations, or they're moving to cloud, the security and management of that is consistent and they're able to harmonize it. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about how organizations are going along this modernization path. They have to still be able to demonstrate business value, measurable outcomes, remain compliant and secure all at the same time. So this is a non-trivial exercise. We understand that. We're accustomed to going into very, very complex environments. And probably the single biggest challenge that most organizations are struggling with are these legacy environments they have. They've really served their purpose over the last several decades, but as the sophistication of ransomware attacks and of adversaries increases, what's becoming more and more apparent is that the resiliency of these legacy systems and the architectures were never designed to deal with today's adversaries. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And this requires a little bit of a mind shift change, both within the operators as well as within leadership, because folks need to begin to move away from, or they need to understand what some of the limitations of their legacy tools are. So in all of the organizations that we're talking to, they typically have let's say 3 teams. You can see here we've got infrastructure, application, and cloud teams. They're all operating sometimes in parallel, sometimes not. They've got lots and lots of tools. And as organizations are putting together these resilience plans, as they're putting together their cloud migration, a large part of that is they've got to reduce the complexity. And this complexity is what's adding vulnerability into your systems. And so what we really try to do is come in and help organizations at a crawl, walk, and run approach begin to make sense. Complex is easy, simple is hard. And when I say simple, by reducing that attack surface, right? By making it less complex for the organizations to defend and more difficult for adversaries to penetrate. And so we get actively involved in this evolution and this modernization strategy. So beyond just the high level, we need to modernize or begin to automate. Before I joined Rubrik, I was one of Rubrik's largest customers in the world. And so, it's really important as you're working with your vendor partners that they're prepared to roll up their sleeves and really get actively engaged. It's not a matter of just selling a bunch of gear and walking away. It's really actively working with the organization along this journey. And that's something that we do on a daily basis. So I put this up because I think it's important for everybody to understand that we really are accustomed to working with project leads, and you need to do that with your partners, right? Where they can dive into the priorities of your organization. And the reality now is that ransomware attacks are bringing infrastructure teams, operating teams, your security team and your infrastructure teams together. The CIO and the CISO are collaborating. You've got your DevSecOps teams. And so helping you understand that, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we refer to this as software-defined data management. That's the resilience capability that we want to be able to provide organizations and help them understand the art of the possible. So whether the team is working around hybrid cloud, whether they're developing a software factory internally, you're trying to improve the customer service and look at the customer experience. And I'll use an example there. We have a customer at a national lab who historically has been managing their data there, and they actually shut down a data center, and he had an application in that data center, and then he realizes he needed to get some data back. And historically, he'd put a ticket in, he'd wait about 3 weeks, they'd send somebody off to Iron Mountain, they'd go and find what he needs, and it took him about 3 weeks to get access to the data he needed. Then he'd have to go and locate it within that volume. That process for him now is literally going into ServiceNow, doing a file level search. All of that data is available to him, and he now has all the data on his desktop in less than 30 minutes. And so when you start understanding that you can add modernization, automation, and resilience into the infrastructure almost on a simultaneous basis, it's a very, very interesting capability. That's what we're going to walk you through here today. So one of the things I want you to be thinking about is, and we're talking about backup, but really data management and your ability to protect, manage, and secure that data anywhere and everywhere it lives. You need to be able to control that. And one of the challenges we have is that with a lot of the legacy architectures, you have remote locations, you have different budgets. People tend to, the analogy I use is when you buy something like a Rubrik, it's like getting a sports car. And people will drive it around in the parking lot in first gear, meaning they just use it for this one narrow use case. And what's important is that your adversaries are looking for your data anywhere and everywhere, right? They're scanning. They've got very, very active research and development teams in terms of how they're performing reconnaissance, trying to target your infrastructures, and not just your core data center on-premise data, but what are the other cloud environments that your administrators may be accessing. And so part of what we try to do is help organizations understand that that security capability, that resilience requirement that you have needs to be everywhere. And it needs to be embedded in all of the data management. And so here, part of what I want you to be thinking about, as you can see, we talk about backup as a service, but as you begin looking at archiving, whether you archive on site to S3 or you're going out to one of the clouds, disaster recovery, right? Are you able to actually do live testing of your DR plan, right? Can you fail over and fail back? And so when you start looking at some of the modern capabilities and technologies that we're walking you through here, it gives you a whole bunch of tools that historically were either too difficult or too expensive for you to even explore. And this complicates your security posture as well. Migrating to the cloud, we've talked about Cloud Archive, and then you can see some of the other areas. The key is that once you move to this converged, hyper-resilient environment, it allows you to do a lot more with your data while you're still providing 24/7 real-time access, and you're maintaining security, and you understand where that sensitive data is. So one of the things as we're walking through this, and we're going to get into the best practices approach around recovery and backup, is you need to make sure that beyond just being able to, in the case of an emergency like a ransomware attack, or if you've got a natural disaster of some kind, you have flooding or other things, is that you can maximize that investment. And so one of the things that we actively engage with all of our customers is helping them understand that beyond just having a plan, let's exercise that recovery and testing, right? And let's do that across data, applications, and systems. If you have second sight, if you need to be able to go to hybrid cloud, all of that core functionality is fairly straightforward. And what we're finding is a lot of the organizations that we're talking to have very seasoned teams that have perfected a whole bunch of manual processes, and they're managing hundreds or thousands of jobs. And what we need to do is, rather than make those really experienced people just manage the day-to-day pick and shovel work, we want to free them up for more strategic, high value operations. And so what you're going to be able to see is when you move to a software defined infrastructure where you have this type of resilience built in, you can create digital twins, you can do automated pen testing, you can do automated patching and upgrading, and you do that all within the backup infrastructure by operationalizing it. Allowing your security team and your infrastructure team to be able to collaborate. So the capability of, if you see an intrusion and you've got sophisticated network perimeter tools, how do you allow that telemetry to better inform your backup policies that you're putting in place so that you can move data if you need to, if you have a sophisticated adversary? And by instrumenting all of the backup infrastructure, you can now see behavioral changes. You can see behaviors that may indicate an attack. And these are the types of visibilities that we want to be able to provide you right out of the box, right? So that's what's really nice. So instead of working across 5, 6, 7 different tools and systems and infrastructures, you can collapse that, and you can begin to become much more proactive when it comes to threat detection and dealing with adversaries and problems like ransomware. So part of what you need to be looking at as you're talking to vendors and you're evaluating tools is your ability to plug that capability into your existing infrastructures, take advantage of your existing automation tools that you may be using on site that will plug into the automation capabilities of the cloud, and it doesn't stick you into one specific environment. You know, our experience has been is when you work with contractors and subcontractors, a lot of the advice they give you is based on, you know, where they're getting the best discounts, where their team has the most certifications and experience, and sometimes, many times, that doesn't match what your mission objectives are from an organizational perspective. So you need to be able to maintain maximum flexibility, and your priorities may change, the mission may change, you may have new directives that are flowed down from stakeholders and leadership, and as an organization, you need to be able to move, manage, and protect that data wherever it exists, and you need to decide where that is, right? So where the data needs to be today, where you want to move it tomorrow, where you want to keep it long term, you've got to be able to move and manage and secure that data based on your requirements, not by a limitation that's been put in place by a tool or by a vendor partner. So, And this was a key area, candidly, why we ended up selecting Rubric at GDIT, because I knew that I had leadership rotations every 2 years. And someone may show up with some really good ideas. And they say, hey, we're going to go left this year. And maybe 3 years later, someone says we're going to go right. And as a team that's operating that infrastructure, you need to make sure that if you have to make those changes, you can still make sure your data is accessible and protected. So the reality here is at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what shiny new object that you buy or that you recommend or that people are coming in and candidly pitching you, you've got to be able to show value to the organization. And so I've got some metrics here around deployments across a whole host of different customers that we have at the state and local and the public sector. And what's really important is that when you're in an organization and you're looking to harden the infrastructure, provide more resiliency, there's always somebody in the room who's worried about how much it's going to cost, how much are we going to save, or hey, we don't have the money, we're going to have to find this through cost savings in other areas. So Fte costs. So in many of our organizations, we're actually providing a 4-to-1 reduction in FTEs. And so what's happening is you can now take those high, those high dollar, very experienced people and put them on more mission critical areas. And so they're able to move them. So we had one organization, for example, and you can see here around complexity, efficiency, and other things. Large organization, they had 8 people managing their infrastructure. The first 2 hours of every day were spent reviewing backup jobs from the day before. They were managing about 1,200 jobs across across that organization. And so we came in, we started to help standardize their SLA policies, their data protection approach, introducing them to some automation. And that team of 8 who were spending about 16 hours a day collectively just restarting failed jobs, after they moved to the platform, it was a total of 15 minutes, right? Instead of managing 1,200 jobs, they were managing 45 jobs. So they ended up effectively having about a $3.5 million soft cost savings that allowed them to go out, and if they needed to add additional security tools, they needed training or other areas, this is a way for you to get much more efficiency out of the infrastructure while you're simultaneously adding additional resilience into it. So this is just a picture that kind of shows you the type of environment that we're able to move across, and that as you're looking at your data protection, you're looking at the attack surface that an adversary is performing reconnaissance on. This is what you're having to deal with as an organization to A, stay secure, and B, make sure you're able to provide visibility of your data as you're moving across all of these different environments. So what I want to do from here is I want to move into some best practices. So we've kind of laid out the art of the possible. When you move into a software-defined data management approach, and you begin to understand that you can move, manage, and protect the data on-prem, cloud, hybrid cloud, what we refer to as tactical edge or remote locations, the types of discussions that we're having with organizations, right? And the issue is that people concerned about their data being secure, the adversaries have gotten very, very good at getting through the infrastructure, right? Modern adversaries are using artificial intelligence and machine learning. They're creating custom design exploits against you. And the reality is that 99% of all of the security tools out there have what we refer to in the IC and the DoD as an a priori requirement, meaning if it's seen it, whether it's a behavior, a signature, a hash, an IP address, a domain, or a behavior even, we're really good at detecting those things. But the reality is these custom exploits don't look like anything you've ever seen before. So what they're able to do is roll through a lot of these security tools at the perimeter network endpoint and application layer, and they're coming in and attacking the traditional 3-tier architectures. And again, they were never designed to really deal with an adversary who could easily come in and begin to move laterally across the traditional media servers, proxy servers, backup targets, and exploiting third-party apps and services to come at and delete, destroy, exfiltrate, and lock up your data. And as we all know, the lateral movement in these large complex environments allow adversaries to come in and get to Active Directory, elevate permissions, steal credentials, and effectively wreak havoc. So you'll hear a lot of folks talk about zero trust and really how do you make the infrastructure more resilient. And my background, especially with Northrop Grumman, where we were protecting the stealth platforms for the Department of Defense, you know, we had this approach of trust nothing, suspect everything, right? And so that zero trust mindset is now permeating across all of government, and it's become sort of a, you know, a kitchen table topic because of the prevalence of ransomware. And so the key here is that you need to, you know, you need to begin to adopt this trust nothing, suspect everything approach, right? And what we're going to show you here is how you want to build that type of, we refer to as a countermeasures approach into your infrastructure. And if you begin to think how an adversary is going to exploit your systems, it allows you to be, you know, to be much more diligent in terms of how you're deciding to grant access, how you're managing identities, how you're allowing people to users with different services and so forth. And so this idea of trust nothing, suspect everything, encrypting your data everywhere. As much as that seems like, oh, that's just common sense, unfortunately, that's not always happening in many of these legacy environments, right? And it's just because they're sprawling, they've been around, they've got a mix of, you know, everything from mainframes and web apps to databases and, you know, old systems that are running on COBOL and Fortran and things like that. And so it's, you know, this is a non-trivial exercise. We understand this isn't that easy. And so one of the things we're going to talk about here is this last piece around immutability. And immutability is a marketing term that's used by many vendors, and it's very important for you to pull the thread with the vendors that you're talking to, with your contractors, with your solutions architects and operators, and really try to understand how are they defining immutable. And the reality is immutable has a very simple definition. If you can change data in your file system, it's not immutable, period. And pushing data off-site or having 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 copies of your data doesn't mean the data is immutable. And it's really important for you to understand that. So that's going to lead us into sort of some of these best principles. And what we want to do is I want to level set for the audience the types of questions you need to be asking your vendor partners and your technology partners and providers, and how are they defining and addressing some of these key areas around cyber resiliency. So we'll first talk about air gap, right? You either don't have, you know, if there's no air gap, that's very simple. Your backups are accessible from the network. And unfortunately, if you're using NFS or SMB and your file shares, you know, your stuff is wide open to an adversary. If you're not already compromised, you're going to be compromised, period. You're not going to get around it. It's just, unfortunately, the reality of where you are. You can have a completely physically disconnected air gap. So like I said, off-site. The challenge is, unfortunately, that a lot of times if you have off-site backups, you still have to put the sort of the gate down to get across that, and adversaries are just following your privileged users across that gate and getting into your air-gapped environment. And then a logical backup is something that we feel is a best practice area where the backups are not are offline and not accessible from the network. We've talked about the immutable file system here, and it's really cut and dry. Don't let somebody use immutability around copies of data in other areas, or whether they're using multi-factor authentication and those types of things. If the system can be edited or changed, it's not immutable, and you need to be aware of that. And candidly, it's the immutability of our file system, which is why we're deployed across the Intel community and used extensively across the Department of Defense, because adversaries have gotten really good at understanding some of these other let's say, clever combinations that people are using to sort of, quote, hide their data. Retention lock is something that's important. For us, that's a human in the loop. So think of it like the nuclear football that the president has. You know, you've got someone else with a second set of keys. This is whether your provider or partner has an actual human in the loop. So if anyone wants to make any other changes or significant changes or alterations to backups and policies, you have to get on the phone, you talk to somebody. There are extensive challenge questions. You've got a second person on there to also validate it, so that someone who appears to be an authenticated user is making changes, but actually is an adversary posing in that in that environment. And then we've already talked about the data encryption and making sure that it's encrypted, not just at rest, but also in transit, north and south, east and west, and that you understand clearly how you're doing that internally. And I have this little thing down here, right? Creating a third copy of data offsite doesn't make it immutability. It's just another copy of the data that, by the way, you're having to pay for. So one of the things that's driving a lot of the resiliency initiatives around ransomware and around cyber attacks, data exfiltration attempts, is being driven, and you'll see the president's executive order. I think it's really important as you're working with your partners and the vendors that they're able to demonstrate to you how they comply with these executive orders, because as they're getting flowed down from the federal level, the White House is actively encouraging state and local governments, as well as the commercial sector, to begin to adhere to this. DHS and CISA, the Office of Management and Budget, are pushing out their zero trust data strategies, their maturity models, as well as their cloud security guidelines. NIST obviously has a very, very well documented framework that I'm sure almost everybody is certainly referencing or looking at. And so it's important for you to understand how organizations map to the cybersecurity focus areas, as well as how they map to compliance and governance areas. And so you can see that in each of these areas. And, you know, candidly, it is a bit of a checkbox exercise, but you need to be able to go through that, because you don't want to start building in security measures that are bolt-ins that actually end up being more kludgy, more expensive, and more difficult. What you really want to be able to do is make sure that your infrastructure and how you're managing it can begin to, let's say, integrate with and really behave according to the threat posture that you're getting. And so this is an overview. And to me, this is a little bit like table stakes. You should be able to allow your infrastructure management tools to interact with your SIM and logging tools, with your endpoint detection and response platforms and systems, and with your SOAR integrations. Because if you get hit, you have to quickly understand the blast radius, where your sensitive data is, implement a recovery plan, and you've got to coordinate and synchronize that with the existing tools that your SOC operation already has. And, you know, it's JSON, it's XML, it's syslog, right? These are API-driven integrations that you can achieve in a fairly straightforward manner. And I think I had on an earlier slide, and go back, is you can go to build.rubrik.com. You can see up here at the top, and go and look at the types of integrations. If you like, you know, if you're used to going to GitHub and you're a hands-on keyboard type, go and look at those. These are the types of integrations, API calls, and automations that you should be able to implement with your tool set, because that's how you build the resiliency in. Let the network security, let your security operations team and your infrastructure teams begin to interoperate in a much more seamless manner. So one of the things that you really need to look at as you're putting your recovery plans together, as you're looking at remediation, as you're hardening the infrastructure, begin to look at your backup and your data protection platforms the way an adversary does. And so this is just it's a good picture that gives you an understanding. I need to go down through, and what are the countermeasures that we have built into the system, right, already, that we're able to make sure that we can scale and rely on, that aren't manual processes, because these are the gaps and holes that an adversary is going to try to exploit. So you can see down the left side there, right? How are you protecting data, identities, users, policies and configurations, services, right? And the file system itself. You have to make sure that that layered approach is put in place, because adversaries are like water. They're going to find a way in. They're going to find the crack. And so you can see here how we've talked a little bit about, end-to-end encryption, making sure that you're securing your Active Directory logins with multi-factor authentication, role-based access controls, understanding the access that local users have, and ensuring, again, trust no one, suspect everything. You have to challenge anywhere and everywhere, right? And you can see down the right-hand side here how we're putting best in breed, and what you need to be doing is looking at the latest security encryption technologies for data in flight, data at rest, data that's moving north and southbound, in and out of the cloud, east and westbound across clusters and environments, understanding and having a flexible key management capability that you're able to leverage and look at. And so you can see as I go down that list, right, with your Active Directory users and group logins, you're securing local admins, and then retention lock, and understanding again that even though someone, quote, appears to be an authenticated, let's say, super user, you can't assume that they are who they say they are. And you have to enforce that each and every time. The days of doing trusting all the users on the network and providing them access are over. You've got to make sure that you've got that multi-layer approach. And so I'll build this out. And again, I like pictures. And so the key is if, we talked a little bit about the complexity. I've got a couple of use cases just to kind of show you what I'm talking about. If you're able to access your backups from the network, I'm just going to red pill you. You're going to be owned if you're not already owned. And the problem is if you've got an adversary that's come through into those infrastructures, they're sitting there, they're performing reconnaissance, they're watching your super users, your administrators, they're accessing Active Directory, they're beginning to spoof credentials and build out that plan to either exfiltrate or encrypt your data, right? And you've got to be very, very, very careful. And it's just the reality of where we are today. And so the legacy systems that are in, 90% of our agency environments and sitting at the county and local level were never designed to deal with an adversary that can come through and begin to move laterally. And so that's why putting in place a zero trust architecture, right? There's, like I said, there's lots of really good publicly available documentation out there for you. You're using things like a logical air gap. You're encrypting data everywhere. You've got a human in the loop, right? To be able to do that. Now, if you have someone who comes in and there is an event, you can recover very, very quickly. Oh, by the way, because of the software-defined tools and the way the systems are architected, you can recover because you've done live DR exercises. You've failed over and failed back. You know what systems are going to come up and where you may have challenges. This is a really, really, really important aspect for you. I saw a report the other day, I think from Sophos, only 7% of customers that have had a ransomware attack have recovered all their data. We've got almost 4,000 customers and 100% of them are recovering all of their data. If you can't afford to lose half your data or more, you need to really be rethinking the impact of ransomware attacks, right? So again, third copies doesn't mean you're going to be able to recover it quickly, and it becomes a real challenge. It lengthens your recovery times. So as we're coming up on time here, I want you to start thinking about what you're dealing with, and this is what we see. So I've got, for example, you can see typical production data centers, what the architectures have looked like over time, where each of those teams and systems are trying to go, and where they may be running into blockers. And it's the complexity and these different architectures that you have and the future vision that organizations are also opening up vulnerabilities to adversaries. And this is that complexity issue I talked about early on. And so what we're doing is helping organizations collapse the infrastructure, begin to automate, and begin to simplify their data protection policies. And again, being able to move data anywhere and everywhere you want. And I'm gonna, I've got a box down here. I know we're talking about resilience and recovery, but guys, cost matters, right? When I deployed Rubrik in my environment, I was an EMC shop before we had it. I saved 90% and improved my security posture. Same thing with offsites, remote sites. This is a typical architecture that we see in many organizations. This all has a cost associated with it. You can begin now to deploy software-defined, highly resilient capabilities where you now have access into all of that data. It's indexed at the file level. It's immediately available via the backup infrastructure. And you can begin, again, to drive these costs down so that you can improve resilience around ransomware attacks. So I'll just build this out. And what we're seeing at the state, local level, in healthcare and education in particular, is that ransomware is coming in, they get a note, and they really have this, do we pay the ransom or do we attempt to recover? Well, in government, you can't pay the ransom, so you have to try to recover, right? And so normally you're going to engage IT ops, security operations, they're going to perform forensics, they're going to try to restore from backups, and many times the backups are compromised. There are lots of white papers that are publicly available, how ransomware gangs are now selling, there are gangs that are selling access to customers with specific security tools, with specific backup infrastructures. They publish playbooks on how to go in and delete your backup infrastructure. And it's really scary. And so, the challenge is if the backups aren't secured and safeguarded, it may take months and months. We've seen customers take 6 months to try to recover. My SLA in the DoD is less than 30 minutes to be able to recover. And so we have to provide that. There's no reason why at the state and local level, regardless of the size and candidly the budget you have, why you shouldn't be able to have those types of SLA policies. So at the federal level, you've got reporting requirements, you've got other issues. They're not worried about ransomware, they're not getting ransomed, they're worried about espionage, data theft, data destruction, they're worried about lateral movement. And now with the software-defined approach where you have this zero trust framework that's put in place, they're now allowing and enabling their IT operations and their security operations teams to execute playbooks, quarantine data, understand where the sensitive data is very, very quickly, and recover in a matter of minutes, and in larger organization, hours or days. So that's the overview and sort of laying out the art of the possible. I think it's important for everybody on the call to understand who some of our partners are, where if you want to dig into specific use cases, you want to see feature functionality, you want to be able to, look at how things are done under the covers, I'd encourage you to reach out to any of our partners. And then here's my information, and Keith Evans, who's the Rubrik rep, so that we can kind of walk you through that. So with that, I think I should hand back control, if I'm correct, Jeanette, and I think you guys have it. So we can open up for Q&A. What a terrible close-up. I need to fix that.
Oh, it's great, Jeff. Thanks. Great close-up. And boy, if I wasn't scared before, I'm a little scared now. No, I'm more than a little scared about the vulnerabilities that exist out here. I've got a couple of questions with a similar bent, so I'm going to start with this and then we'll go from there. But I invite all of the attendees on the call right now that if you have a question, shoot it over to us now, type it into the question box, or follow up with us after we do our Q&A here. Again, this is Mark Levine. I'm the Deputy Director of the New York State Association of Counties, and we're here to talk about a tool that should be part of a county's cybersecurity posture and planning to protect yourself from potential incidents, breaches, ransomware events. So Jeff, if an authenticated user has already been infiltrated or hacked and doesn't know it, they could possibly let the hacker in when they get in. How can we keep authenticated users from carrying or piggybacking on hidden adversaries?
So that's the challenge, right? Everybody's looking for the silver bullet to figure out, how do I find an adversary that's behaving or appears to be an authenticated user? And this is where I talked earlier about making sure that your infrastructure and your security tools that you've already deployed can talk to each other, right? I think gone are the days where the infrastructure team is giving the security team the Heisman and vice versa. So if you have someone who is posing as an authenticated user, there's a large probability that they're probably doing things out of the ordinary, either from locations, time zones, and either with over certain periods of time, files they're accessing, and so forth. And so this is an area where within our platform, for example, we see that behavior. If we see anomalous file access, anomalous file changes, and other behaviors, the key is that your backup infrastructure should be instrumented, and the telemetry around that instrumentation should help inform you of those types of attacks. Someone who is posing as an authenticated user, but who probably is behaving a little bit differently. So it's not just how they appear, it's what they're also doing when they have access. And that's where you have to be vigilant. And we've got some really interesting cloud-based capabilities that give you all of those analytics and alert you virtually in real time so that you're not caught off guard. So I hope that answered the question.
It did, but I have a follow-up. It may be overly basic, but so how do you know that there's an anomaly happening? Like, how does your software alert Apple County that there's an anomaly, that there's somebody in the backup or there's somebody in the data?
Yeah. So the short answer is when you begin indexing your backup infrastructure at the file level, we begin to understand how that data is being accessed, how that data is interacted with, where it lives, and so forth. And so historically, again, people have created backups and they stick them off to the side and they don't really think about it until they need it. Because we're actively providing daily delta changes, we understand all of that. So there's a behavioral pattern, there's a ton of analytics that occur. And so we use some artificial intelligence and some machine learning techniques to begin to baseline the activity and behavior of your backup infrastructure to do that. And that's where the automatic alerts, integration with your security tools and your teams is made possible. So it really comes down to if you think you can begin to operationalize the backup infrastructure, you begin to get much more value out of it, as opposed to thinking of it as shelfware on a bad day or a rainy day if there's been an issue. What's happening at the Intel and the DoD level is they're beginning to understand, and they realize now that the data environment is where the adversary is going. So if I can instrument that and I can understand the types of behaviors that adversaries display when they're moving laterally, when they're trying to access your data and systems, you can now be alerted in that. And it doesn't just live at the network level anymore. This is really a concept of bringing zero trust down into the infrastructure as opposed to leaving it at the security perimeter. And we're happy to provide specific demos of what that looks like, how the alerts are done, and how that's integrated on any follow-on. And that's Keith and our team are here to help provide that to the counties. And that's even something we could do as a follow-on if we've got enough interest there. Mark.
Thank you. Thank you. And I've got a follow-up from the first question, which was this question about the infiltration was about legitimately authenticated users and not the piggybackers or the posers. So how can we keep authenticated users from bringing in the infiltrators? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, you know, I don't know that there's a short answer to that, right? I mean, that's what we're here to do is help you, is help organizations deploy countermeasures native to the backup infrastructure, right? And you've got different authentication mechanisms, different security tools, application security, and other things. What we try to do, as we went back through that stack earlier, Mark, is make sure that at each one of those areas that you have some sort of challenge mechanism. And you're going to get to the point where a bad actor is going to try to do something to the environment that even an authenticated user is not going to be allowed to do. And that's where that retention lock, for example, is a really important part of that. Hey, this authenticated user now wants to change this policy, right? They want to delete this. They want to change some timing. They want to do some other behaviors that are historically associated with malicious behavior. And that's where the retention lock piece, from our perspective, really allows you to make sure that doesn't happen.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I know a number of counties are considering moving data or pieces of their systems to the cloud. These interactions or the working with these vendors, the vendors are saying that, you know, moving to the cloud is a more secure environment. Is there a role for backup and recovery, or is just moving to the cloud, moving your data to the cloud, is that good enough, or what other things should the county be preparing for as they do a project that moves some part of their system into the cloud?
Yeah, well, you know, that's so the reality is that, you know, people are hacking into clouds all the time, right? So you hear things about, you know, S3 buckets that are wide open and data's getting exposed and PII or PHI is getting spilled. And so I think the reality is that when you move to the cloud, there's some flexibility there, but there's also lack of control and visibility and some other things that you have to be concerned about. And the real issue is that if you actually read the fine print, the native cloud data protection policies, it's a shared protection model, and they're really only going to protect your data for you for about 30 days. So think about almost like an email box where it gets aged off. You may be able to get as much as 90 days, but the reality is at the public sector level, particularly with PII, or if you've got network security data, or you've got VIP data, or FOIA, or other requirements, Mark, you have much longer data retention requirements that you have to demonstrate or enforce. And the commercial clouds native tools do not do that. There's a reason why Rubrik's the largest data protection vendor in the world for Microsoft. They're also an investor in Rubrik. They took an equity investment because of the level of protection and resilience that we provide within their own cloud infrastructure. And then we're the #2 data protection vendor in the world for AWS. So the reality is you're going to get some convenience, you're going to get flexibility, you're going to get scalability and other values from the cloud, but you're not going to get data protection capabilities that are consistent with what you need to be able to demonstrate and remain compliant in a regulated or in a public sector environment. It's not there. So it's critically important.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jeff. Another probably overly basic question, but I'm throwing this out there. What if our county does get a ransomware attack, right? How do we ensure that our data is protected? That's one. And two, you know, there's lots of questions out there whether governments should be paying ransom. And then how do we recover as quickly as possible? I know you covered part of this, but do you have an answer to that
Yeah,
Three
so
part question.
the issue is it's going to go back to a couple of core areas. And one is the immutability of the file system, right? If your data if the file system where you're storing your data is not immutable, you're going to struggle to recover because the adversary will be able to delete, edit, change, encrypt, destroy that data based on what the vast majority of legacy systems are providing right now, right? And so that's why when you talk to a lot of the big players, they're saying, well, just make another copy and put it off site, right? Well, the reality is that if you get hit, you need to be able to quickly understand what's the scale and scope of the attack. You need to quickly understand what's your most recent good copy. You need to be able to understand if you've got ransomware or malware in the infrastructure, how do you quarantine that? And then how do you elegantly bring back your priority systems? And the reality is, from our perspective, we're literally doing that with a push of a button. It's fully and completely automated. In most traditional systems, that process that I just laid out is manual, goes across lots of different systems and infrastructures, typically takes days and weeks at a minimum, and is very, very, very cumbersome. And that's the reality. And so, we've got, there's lots of use cases that we have, and we're happy to provide those out. City of Durham, Yuba County, and others that were Rubrik customers that were hit by ransomware attacks and were literally back up within hours and days, versus other organizations. We worked with a healthcare system who had one of our competitors' systems in place, and they literally were down for 6 months. They couldn't. Their patient system was down, their lab system was down, their pharmacy system was down, the ERP system was down. They physically unplugged unplugged every device, rebuilt, DNS, rebuilt all their infrastructure. That's really what you're going to be faced with if you get hit with many of these legacy systems. And candidly, that's the benefit that we're going to provide. You're not going to have to go through that.
Thank you, Jeff. We're coming on the hour. I would like to give you one opportunity here to mention anything you haven't yet and that you think our attendees need to know. Then I'll give us a little closing statement. And again, we appreciate your time and expertise here, Jeff.
Yeah, I think the number one thing is that we all have lots of vendors talking to us every day. The resiliency piece is very important, and it's critical that you get down to the brass tacks as you're doing your due diligence, as you're doing your POCs, as you're evaluating capabilities. Ask them about immutability and ask them to define specifically what they mean by immutability. It's a critical aspect. I would ask them if they have any patents around immutability and see how they respond. The other area is you need to be able to find out what's it going to take to manage this, and can you integrate the tools off the shelf, right, through APIs and simple calls to integrate with your network security tools, your automation capabilities, EDRs, and other tools that right now everyone is driving towards. And if they can't provide a simple, straightforward answer with a clear, documented, either reference architecture or some documentation, it's probably marketing, and it's really not going to work.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Rubrik. I want to take this opportunity to thank NYMER for sponsoring this webinar and for providing top-notch insurance protection for more than 930 local governments in New York State, including 33 counties. I want to thank you all for joining us. This is part of a series of resources that NISAC is committed to delivering in terms of cybersecurity awareness for counties and local governments across New York State. Look for a model cybersecurity plan. Look also for a primer for non-technical county leaders. All of these resources will be made available to NISAC County members over the next several weeks and in a couple of months. So thank you for joining us today, and have a wonderful, wonderful November 3rd. Take care.